Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
I'm so pleased to welcome you back to part two of a two-week series dealing with a very interesting book. And I would like to show you this book. It's called Sharing the Dream, White Males in Multicultural America. This book came out in November of 2004, and we're now in early 2005. The book was published by Continuum International Publishing Group in New York and London. The author of that book is with us again this week as he was last week. We welcome to the program Dominic J. Polera, who is an author, a commentator, a consultant, who writes, speaks, and consults on issues particularly related to race, national origin, ethnicity, and gender. In this particular book, the author discusses, as it indicates, white males in our American society and how they're relating to the issue of diversity as a very, very major force in our country throughout its history of decision-making and how that is in some ways changing in the leadership to some extent. Our guest also wrote another book that's most interesting called Visible Differences, Why Race Will Matter to Americans in the 21st Century. Last year we had him on the program dealing with that book, but we're emphasizing on these two programs this new book that he's come out with. Our guest also addressed his audiences all over the United States and around the world, and when he writes these books he interviews hundreds of people as well as doing other research from other publications and data, and particularly demographics. With that, Mr. Polera, welcome to the program. It's great to have you here again.
Thank you very much, Professor Stewart. I'm very happy to be here.
We enjoyed our discussions last week, and we're happy to have back Erna Reinhardt, our panelist, who is the Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College, and she shall commence today's questioning.
Dominic, welcome back to the show. It's great to have you here again. In case our viewers missed last week, what I'd like you to do at the beginning of the show this week is give us a brief overview of your most recent book, which is titled Sharing the Dream. But I'm also real intrigued with the title of the book. It's not just called The Dream, but it's called Sharing the Dream. And maybe explain how you came about to choose that title.
Okay. I proceed on the premise in the book that white males in multicultural America are sharing the dream. And by dream, I mean a couple of different things. There's the American dream, which one can define somewhat simply as the chance to achieve success as you define it, which differs for different people. And also the dream that Dr. King talked about in his famous I Have a Dream speech in 1963. Factors like that in talking about the dream. And when it comes to sharing the dream, we have seen in the last 30 or so years that white males in this country are sharing the dream. Some are doing so voluntarily, and others are doing so involuntarily, but sharing it they are. And by sharing, I mean that the whole idea that used to be the case as recently as 40 years ago, that most of the positions in our society, at the national level, the local level, and every level in between, were held by white men. That has changed. It's never going to happen again in response to a couple of factors. One, the changing demographics of our nation, the fact that each year we become progressively a little less white each year, and also the idea, particularly since the mid-1960s, that we want to expand the opportunities available to all of us. And traditionally, women and people of color did not have the same opportunities to succeed in this country as did white men. So what we've seen, particularly in the last 30 to 35 years, is a rhetorical emphasis in particular on including women and people of color. The extent to which it's substantive depends to some extent on your ideological background. Some people on the left would say we have done very little really in terms of substance, whereas some on the right would say, let's just hit the brakes here. It's gone a little fast for us in terms of some of the diversity programs and multicultural initiatives. And, a lot of people in the middle would say the pace is just about right.
Excellent. Go Go ahead, Tony.
I want to talk about some examples. Last week we spent almost the entire program on the overall content of the book, and our viewers who were here last week would, I guess, not want us to, just be repetitious. So we'll move on and talk about some of the particular case studies in your book. You've very clearly explained just now why the purpose of the book and dealing with it. And last week we talked about some of the demographics that I believe white men make up approximately 35% of the population today. So in that case, in a minority position. But what also intrigued me about your book was that there are communities that are nationwide, they'd be a minority, but not in the particular community they're in. Gary, Indiana is an example where I believe about 9% of the residents within the city of Gary are African Americans. Yet they've elected a white male mayor, and I believe he's in his second or third term. And so they had great confidence in him, although they certainly have the votes to elect someone that is African American. Would you use him, first of all, as an example of, I think what some of your examples do, they illustrate cooperation going on between majority and minority populations in particular communities?
Okay. In many cases, particularly as affirmative action and diversity initiatives started to develop in the 1960s and 1970s, there was the idea that if a particular group made up a majority in a particular context, that a member of that group should be the leadership figure, whether it was as the principal of a school, the chief of police, or the mayor of a city. And in many cases, this has come to pass. In the last, say, 5 to 10 years, we have seen many cases now, an increasing number of cases, where you are having white males chosen by people of color to hold leadership positions in contexts where most of the individuals are people of color. Now, one of the things about this is that the reasoning, for instance, that only a black can represent blacks, to some extent is regarded by some observers as having a downside as well, because there are many parts of our country that are predominantly white or where there's a white majority. And if one embraces the logic that only an African American, for instance, can represent African Americans, that some people might try to use that logic to say that in a community where most of the people are white, then the leadership roles should be held by white people. And fortunately, that kind of reasoning doesn't come to pass. There are many examples of communities that are 70 or 80% white, where there's a person of color as the police chief, as the superintendent of schools, and so forth. Now, in recent years, we've seen examples where white males now, in these very, very ethnically and racially diverse contexts, are starting to be chosen. For instance, in Gary, Indiana, Gary was a pioneer of sorts with regard to this trend, because whites make up 10% of the city, and they made up 10% as long ago as the mid-1990s. The city had had a long succession of African American mayors for 28 years. Gary itself had been a pioneer before in a city that was about half and half in terms of the demographics, and electing a black mayor, and then the city became, the African American population increased over the years, to the point by 95 there was an overwhelming black majority. That year, however, the citizens of Gary chose a white mayor. And what makes that so fascinating is, in certain contexts, a specific group such as African Americans or Latinos may make up a majority of the population, but they don't make up a majority of the electorate. This is an example where a white man was chosen by black voters to lead the city. Now, someone would say, well, why was he chosen? Well, there are a number of explanations. One of which was that as a white man, he represented change. And a number of the black voters in the city wanted change from the current administration. And he ran he's a very attractive candidate who ran a good campaign and reached a lot of people. And then as mayor, he proved to be very, very solicitous of the needs and interests of his constituents. This is a city of over 100,000 people. After the workday ends, he will go investigate a citizen complaint about a pothole on the street in front of a person's home. And that people really respond to that. And his message of reform and of change is in many respects a raceless one. People have responded to that. And we're seeing now with a lot of the leaders who are white males in these very, very diverse contexts, they often have a largely raceless message. That's not to say, they don't take into account the demographic composition of their constituency. They most definitely do. But at the same time, they're focusing on issues that bring us together.
There's another example that could not be in your book because it just happened, but what you're indicating that there are other reasons why voters vote the way they do other than the fact of race or even gender, whatever it may be, that although that certainly can be a factor or consideration in the recent election in November 2004, first of all the Republican and Democratic women senators were reelected to office this time. But in open seats where there was no incumbent, there were several women candidates for the Senate, and I believe in each case they lost to a man. So even though a majority of voters in presidential years tend to be women, so whether you're talking about race or gender, whatever, they are factors that people don't always vote for someone who's of their same gender or their same race. Mm-hmm. And again, that data would support what you said mm-hmm. about Gary, Indiana.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things is, and oftentimes if you look at our history, it's very understandable that people from communities that were traditionally excluded would want to see their co-ethnics in positions of power. There's a very good rationale and for doing so, and there's also a substantial amount of literature that points to the benefits that accrue to particular communities when you have people from those communities in power.
We talked about last week, if I interrupt, that we're more enriched and better off if at the table we have diversity at the table,
right,
both as to race and gender, etc.
Right, very definitely. Now, what you're talking about is that we Americans do not always vote along racial lines or in terms of gender. Now, just a few examples. There has been tremendous pride in a number of elections, such as in 1992, the year of the woman, in which many women turned out and elected a record number of women senators.
And state legislators.
And state legislators, exactly. Now, you fast forward a number of years, there have been other elections in which a specific female candidate will calculate that her gender will be an asset in a contest against multiple male opponents. It doesn't always turn out that way. A couple of cases in point. In 1998, Jane Harmon was running for governor of California in the Democratic primary, and she had two major male opponents, and she lost. And California is an example where women have a wonderful track record of getting elected. They've had two female senators since 1993. Both, were elected, in 1992 election. And Jane Harmon, nonetheless lost the gubernatorial primary to a man, Gray Davis. Another example would be the 1998 Senate primary. These are all, I should say, Democratic primaries we're talking about in New York State, in which Geraldine Ferraro ran against two male candidates for the Democratic Senate nomination. She lost. Charles Schumer, a man, was nominated by the Democrats, and the margin wasn't even close. And in those cases, clearly, the winning candidate, who happened to be male, benefited from substantial female support. So looking at gender, for instance, you're seeing a series of examples in which women are sometimes very proud and happy to vote for female candidates, and then in other cases where gender is simply not very relevant. Now, with regard to race, I'd say that if a black Republican were nominated for president by the GOP, and his opponent happened to be a white male Democrat, it'd be my guess that most African Americans would vote for the white male Democrat. There would be an uptick in support, in all likelihood, among African Americans for the black Republican, but issues often trump a person's ethnic or racial or gender background in many cases. Now, that said, if all things are the same in terms of different positions and everything, then yeah, there are many cases in which people might be happy to vote for a person on symbolic grounds to see, say, more people from their group in public office.
Yeah, thank you. Earl Reinhardt.
Dominic, you have traveled all over the world and all over our country, gathering research and gathering information about this particular topic. And my question, I'm interested in how geography plays a part in people's attitudes and whether or not they embrace diversity. In your research and in your findings, would you say that urban America is different or similar to rural America in how they embrace diversity and how white males are accepting what's happening in our country?
Well, urban America, of course, is virtually in every case the most ethnically and racially diverse part of our country. There's no question about it. And not just in terms of ethnic and racial diversity, but also in terms of religion and social class, sexual orientation, those factors. So a white male or anyone else who grows up in one of our large urban areas is going to, in all likelihood, have the most exposure of anyone to the widest array of experiences with people from different backgrounds. Now, at the same time, rural America in some parts of our country is not so homogeneous. Now, if we look at rural America, traditionally you've had the black-white diversity that's common in much of the American South, and you also have the white American Indian diversity you're going to find in parts of the Great Plains and parts of the West. Then in parts of the Southwest, you have Anglo-Latino diversity in terms of rural areas. As a result of the hiring practices of, say, beef, pork, and poultry processing plants, for instance, we've seen influxes of Latinos and, to some extent, people of Asian ancestry to different parts of America that traditionally either had two main groups or were predominantly white. So we're seeing communities in the South, for instance, that were either mainly black and white or mainly white that now have substantial Latino populations, and it's reconfiguring the dynamics locally. And then in parts of the Midwest, you've had communities that were almost all white that are now grappling with such matters as bilingual education, the issue of whether English should be declared an official language in a given county. So in the main, urban America is where we, of course, have our most diversity, and white males, as with anybody else, are going to be most affected by it there.
I just thought of a question that from the reading of your book, and I have read this book as I did your other book, but one of the things in the book that's very obvious, and you've said it on the program, is that in the white male community, of those in decision-making positions in particular, some are embracing the diversity of white males, and others are concerned or have reservations, and I suppose in some of their cases they're concerned about what their role is going to be, particularly if they're fairly young, and older white males are going to be in the retirement for long, or maybe not as concerned. Do you have any, from all your research, do you have any characteristics between these two groups of men and their philosophy? Are there some characteristics why some white men are much more supportive of change and diversity, where others are reservation? Did something emerge from your study that indicated why that all white males do not look at this the same?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are a number of factors that will sensitize a white male to some of these issues in a way that some other people might not have that same sensitivity. That's not to say that a person who doesn't have a lot of exposure to multiculturalism is going to be insensitive. It's just that the person may not have any familiarity with multiculturalism. One of which is family ties. A white male who marries a woman of color or who has close relatives of color is more likely to have had experiences that lead him to be more focused on these types of issues. For instance, if a white guy's at the grocery store and he has a biracial child, he may experience, or going through life, he may experience things a little differently when he has his child or children with him. Another factor, and this varies by the person, it might be a transformational experience of some kind, a course in college, or time spent abroad in a given country. So things like that. And another factor, of course, that's very important is where a person grows up. Some people, some of the most emphatic proponents of diversity in our country, originally grew up in predominantly white areas. Then they went to college and they began to focus on some other issues. And then some people who have grown up in places like Southern California and in New York City, to them it's second nature. And if they have left-leaning politics or left-of-center politics in many cases, they become very conscious advocates of diversity. Now, I don't want to say that being pro-diversity is solely the province of our friends on the left, because I think it's possible, very possible, to be on the right and be pro-diversity. Very few Americans today are going to disagree with diversity as a good. Very few of us are going to disagree with that. Now, where we differ, of course, as many people have said, is how do we go about maximizing the opportunities that are available to all of us? Some people, non-discrimination laws are enough, period. That's it. And then there are others who disagree with that quite emphatically. So the policies that we have right now, and with the courts making decisions they do, are pretty much where a majority of the American people are. Virtually all of us are going to acknowledge that diversity is a good. And now some people may tell pollsters that simply because they feel it's the right thing to say, and they don't really care either way, or they're, in some cases, downright hostile to people of color. But I think if you look at all the opinion data over the years, while our friends on the left would say there hasn't been enough progress, we're seeing a slow but steady, in some cases it's been fairly fast, evolution of attitudes. Now, we have some space in terms of what we need to do yet. Like, for instance, most Americans would not be hostile to interracial marriage in the aggregate. They're just not going to be hostile to it, which is quite a sea change from even 40 or 50 years ago. At the same time, if their son or daughter came home with a potential spouse of a different race, in some cases, you might have people who support interracial marriage in the abstract who might be uncomfortable with it when it comes to them, into their household.
Actually, the Loving versus Virginia that brought an end to anti-miscegenation laws, that is, that forbid interracial marriage, only took place in 1967. So that is a real change, and obviously a very positive one, that when two adults love one another of different races, they should, why does the state have any right to deny them that wonderful relationship? And so we have changed that way. Just one other point here, and then back to Erna, and that is one other thing about, you've really articulated clearly why white males may look at different about how we deal with diversity. But in addition to education or marriage or whatever it may be, how about such things as self-esteem and confidence about oneself? So was that a factor in your studies that may affect how men feel threatened or not threatened in relation to their future and positions? Mm-hmm. Did you find that in any of your studies?
Well, if I'm not answering what you're saying, please interrupt me. One thing that sociologists have found is that when people from different groups who are from the same socioeconomic background interact with each other, that what they describe as equal status contact works wonders generally in terms of reducing barriers and bringing people together, because it's my opinion, as it is the case for many Americans, that there's far more that unites us than which divides us. Now, another thing that's important and that we must stress is the importance of economic opportunities, because when the economy is booming, people are far less likely to engage in what might be described by some people as the blame game.
So are you saying that if a man feels very secure in his position, and economic secure, maybe even outside of his position, he has quite secure economic standing, that he may look at that different than a person who's not secure in their job or does not have a solid financial basis or for retirement, for example?
Well, someone could be quite affluent and by the standards of the world be quite successful in an economic sense, but still not be particularly fond of multiculturalism. Now that person is never going to engage in any hateful activities, mind you, okay? But it's possible that, again, going back to something like intermarriage, which is really fundamentally a litmus test issue, the person might not be super thrilled if his son or daughter came home with someone from a different racial group. Now, oftentimes, observers have talked about social class as a really important factor when it comes to where people stand on racial issues, because there have been some politicians in our nation's history who have tried to use the race card, for instance, to divide people. And there have been instances in which, for instance, black people and white people have had similar economic interests in certain contexts, but there have been political figures who have rallied people around different issues, such as cultural issues. And that was far more common, say, 100 years ago than it is today, because in part, political figures who are seen as explicitly playing to prejudice virtually have no role whatsoever in mainstream American politics, particularly in the last 20 years. In fact, a candidate who might be perceived even to some extent to be somewhat biased in some cases, at least with regard to people of color, is not likely to have any kind of respectability. Now,
I'm sorry.
Oh, please.
The clock is 1. Sorry that we cannot continue this, Dominic, but thank you very much, Dominic Polera, for being our guest these 2 weeks. It's been very informative about your book called Sharing the Dream, White Males in Multicultural America. And I hope they'll put up your website. If people want to pursue this with you, they can do so. It may have already put it up, but if they haven't, we'd like for the viewers to see your website or how they could get in touch with you. You might just quickly also tell them what that website is, or for how they could contact you.
Okay, yeah, www.dominicpolera.com, and there's an email address on there, dominic@dominicpolera.com, and if someone feels that he or she wants to say something, I'd love to hear it.
Well, on that note, we have to bring the permanent conclusion. On behalf of Erna Reinhardt and our staff, we thank you for this 2 weeks. It's been very informative,
Thank you.
We appreciate your time, and good luck in your work in the future.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join us again this next week at the same time. We'll interview another personality. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.